So my name is Alex Capitan, and I am one of the 4 members of the Transforming Hearts Collective. Teddy is another of the 4 members, and the other 2 folks in our collective are Reverend Michael Slack and Lelena Romero, and the 4 of us are chosen family and support faith groups in living our values and being places of radical welcome, specifically for queer and trans people of all races, classes, disabilities and abilities, ages, etc. So folks with multiple marginalized identities who are our people, we want to be able to sort of support our folks and support spaces in being places where our folks can get our spiritual needs met. So that's a little bit about what we do. And yes, I am a lifelong Unitarian Universalist. I'm originally from Milwaukee, and currently we live in Western Massachusetts on Pecumtuck land. My pronouns are Z and per, which is short for person. Z stands in for he or she, and per stands in for his, her, or him. And you can also call me Alex repetitively. And I also answer to he among chosen family and people who are like, yes, he doesn't mean man. So I use different pronouns with different people. How about you?
I'm Teddy. Teddy Drake, and for those who ever see other stuff about me in the world, you'll also see that under Teo Drake, so it really depends on the context, but Google will largely pull me up as Teo. Either is fine. He, him, his, and as Alex said, I'm one of the 4 members of the collective. I am not UU. I'm about as UU adjacent as any non-UU could possibly ever be, but I am a Buddhist. I practice yoga. My kind of spiritual path is largely in that arena, and a lot of my work is often in that arena. And so embodied spiritual practice and sort of the ways in which we can get into our hearts and our bodies to kind of hold us when in discomfort and hold us in sort of response over reaction is a big part of what I do. I do, where Alex and Michael do a lot of institutional work, that I tend to do work more directly in the community. Right now we're running a trauma project for trans folks living with HIV, of whom I am, and those are my siblings. So that's kind of the work that I do. And outside of that, I am a woodworker and an artisan. So I make a lot of fun little wood things and boxes and stuff.
What we're hoping to do is do a bystander intervention workshop for you all to give you some grounding and some skills and some practices for the work of really living and practicing covenant with each other at SUUSI. That's the goal. So I'm going to go ahead and share slides. Fabulous. So I think we want to just start with some grounding.
All right. So we're going to give you a lot of information, but the information is never going to be as useful as it can be and needs to be if it stays in our heads. And so if folks are willing, we're just going to stop for a moment and kind of get grounded. And I really deeply believe that this work is heart-centered work, because it's community, it's built in community, right? It's built in what it means to create a community that can hold all of us. And so, just find your seat, whatever that is for you, and just drop your shoulders and just find your breath. Don't make it do anything other than what it's doing, but find it. So just gentle inhales, exhale. So notice what's touching the floor. Just chair, your feet. Some of you may be sitting on the floor, whatever. Notice the earth. Where's your grounding to the earth? And as you're breathing, if it feels comfortable, if you can lean back against something solid, so your chair, the wall. If not, then just kind of notice or feel sort of strength behind you. Notice something just that can hold you, right? Your spine. And just feel it for a moment. Let your body come in contact with it. And as you breathe, try to let your breath come in contact with that. We're rooted in the earth. There's something that has our back. And then as you're breathing, just direct your breath to your heart space. If you are interested in and willing, rub your hands together, warm them up, right? And hand on the heart, hand at your core, belly, whatever, right? And breathe into, particularly your heart space. Feel that breath right through your heart space into your hand. Just call your attention there. Now, hold or try in breath to hold the warmth at your heart space and the solidity at your back. Allow them to coexist. I deeply believe that it is impossible to open our hearts wide to the world in the ways that this work calls us to do if we aren't aware of what has our back. Our community, right? Our spiritual practice, our faith, right? The earth around us, like being rooted in that we are not alone. We don't carry this alone, that something, someone has our back, allows us to fully open our hearts. It's a duality that has to coexist. So just gentle breath coming out of it. Just again, sort of, move your jaw, drop your shoulders, look around, sigh, wiggle if you're a wiggler. Just kind of come back to that place at any point where the energy either feels like it's bubbling up or feels like neurologically kind of shutting down, because some of us do one or the other. So just pay attention to that. So.
Thank you. Thank you all. So while our hearts are open for a second, we wanted to just invite you all to just, in the comfort of your own mind, or if you're the kind of person who likes to write, perhaps writing on something nearby or on a device, just take a minute to consider this question. There's two of them. What is at the heart of SUUSI? And what would the world lose if SUUSI didn't exist anymore? Just allow your heart to stay open and ponder this question. These are the stakes. This is why it's worth doing this. What we're about to engage with and ponder and sit with today and figure out how to practice is worth it. Even though it can be really hard, it is definitely going to be uncomfortable. It's worth it. It's a practice. It's a spiritual practice, what we're about to engage with. And so we need to be rooted in our hearts, and we need to be grounded in why this is worth it and what we're fighting for when we do this work. We wanted to just take a minute to also ground ourselves in what's real in this moment, right? For SUUSI as a community. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, I wanted to reiterate that Western Carolina University has agreed to host SUUSI this year, and they have put SUUSI on notice that this could be the last year if some things don't change, right? Behaviors that have been a problem include rudeness to WCU staff, excessive demands on staff, trashing dorms, breaking North Carolina's laws around substance use, and general just not being great humans to each other, right? And that's tough. That is really hard to hear. And I know for a lot of people that is brand new information that you weren't aware of. And so it's really hard to be faced with the truth that SUUSI's two previous homes, Radford University and Virginia Tech, canceled SUUSI's contract, citing similar concerns. So this isn't new, unfortunately. Even though it might be new information, it's not new behavior. And it's something that the entire community has to take a responsibility for in order for SUUSI to continue to exist, right? One of the things that Teo and I were talking about earlier when we were planning this time together was this idea that when we're at SUUSI, we are guests in someone else's home. SUUSI feels like home, right? But the community of SUUSI is the home. The location that is being offered up for that community is someone else's home. It is, SUUSI is a guest in that home. And not only that, but when we're at SUUSI, we are representatives of Unitarian Universalism. We are representatives of this faith. And so when people behave poorly, that's what our hosts then think Unitarian Universalism is all about. That's their association with this religion. So not only are we guests in someone else's house, but we are actually representing our faith when we are at SUUSI in that space, right? And the other thing that's true is that beyond the concerns with WCU itself, SUUSI, like so many other, probably every other UU community, is grappling with some really big stuff right now around how to truly live into its commitments to be a safe and affirming home for people of all races, classes, disabilities and abilities, genders, sexualities, ages, and more, right? That's the commitment. That is who SUUSI is at its heart, who it wants to be, its affirmation and its mission. Yeah, its mission. And over the last 2 years in particular, because the format changed, because we were online instead of in person, we had different kinds of interactions. We had different access to different people and different ways in which people were interacting. And SUUSI members with marginalized identities, particularly folks of color and trans folk and non-binary folk, have shared the ways that they have been hurt and have felt excluded and uncared for within SUUSI community, which is also incredibly painful, I think, for everyone. So being and building the sort of community that SUUSI strives to be is hard, and it takes work. It takes care, it takes collective spiritual practices around unlearning oppression and supporting each other and growing and living our values, right? This is ongoing spiritual work. So SUUSI is being given a second chance and a final chance by WCU to practice its values. So that's really the most important thing that can happen at SUUSI this year, right? Is this work of practicing our values.
And I think, one of the things I heard in conversations with Kimberly and other SUUSI folks was that I don't think it's actually a overstatement to say that if this does not work, there is nowhere else to go, right? Like there's a reputation among universities that makes it really hard to find someplace else. Like it's not, oh, we'll just go somewhere else. At this point in time, this is sort of a make or break moment that is really going to impact SUUSI's future, particularly in a lived in-person experience.
Mm-hmm, exactly. Great. So that's the heavy stuff, right? But that's why we're all here. That's why we're engaging in this video, in this training, to try to figure out where do we go from here. So thank you so much for making that commitment and showing up for that invitation. We wanted to take just a moment to talk about covenant, because that's at the heart of this work. It's at the heart of this community of SUUSI, right? And SUUSI has a relatively new covenant that a lot of really incredible work went into, and big props to the Covenant accountability team for and those who came before, for everything that those folks have done as leaders in this community to help articulate these practices that make SUUSI possible, that build this community. So the things that are at the heart of SUUSI's covenant are safety, trust, validation, affirmation, accountability, and reconciliation. And there's even more detail on the SUUSI website on each of these key practices. But these are the agreements that we make to one another. They're the promises that we make to one another when we enter into SUUSI community, whether that community is online, whether that community is in person. These are the promises that we're making to each other that keep this community together. All right. So the next thing we wanted to do is just briefly talk about culture, because one of the things that's true is that covenant is a way of building a culture, a way of creating norms and practices that we engage with together that really dictate the way things are, right? So we want to talk about how culture and the way things are is actually synonymous, but this word culture gets used to mean a lot of different things. So we want to make sure that we're all on the same page about what we mean when we say culture in the context of this training. And there's two quotes on this slide that we think are particularly great. The first is by Ann Stewart, who says, "Culture is how you do life," which I think is awesome. To break that down a little further, Tema Okun, who's an amazing white anti-racism organizer from the South, says that culture is the set of values, beliefs, norms, and standards held by a group of people in order to ensure the group's ability to operate. And to break it down even further, the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond says, culture is a way of life. Culture is created and recreated by individuals, groups, communities, and institutions in every act of our daily lives. Culture is expressed and passed on through language, values, symbols, history, attitudes, behavior, food, music, dance, art, patterns of child rearing, and making love, which is amazing, right? So sometimes people will say the word culture and they're talking about nationality, or they're talking about ethnicity, or they're talking about, a different country, for example. But when we're talking about culture in this training, it's a much broader definition, because any group of people can have a culture. Any group that has something in common, whether that's race, whether that's where you live, whether that's your age, whether that's your membership in SUUSI, whether that's your workplace, it could even be your friend group. On Tuesdays, we wear pink, right? That's a culture. So SUUSI has a culture, a congregation has a culture, a state or a city can have a culture. And the trick is figuring out what is SUUSI's culture, and how is what we're creating, this way of being, this how things are done here, is that in line with our values? Is that in line with our covenant, right? So that's the key thing to be thinking about when we think about culture. One of the things that certainly Michael and I talk about quite a bit when we do work with churches and other UU groups is the iceberg model of culture, because we find it really useful to be able to explain how this plays out in practice, right? And we didn't make this up. This is a very common sociology concept of thinking about culture, where culture is an iceberg. And the very obvious manifestations of culture are just the tip of the iceberg that you can see above the surface. So the things you can see and taste and touch and just immediately notice and associate with a particular culture, right? It's the artifacts, symbols, arts, holidays, rites of passage, that kind of thing. Dress. When you go to a different country, the first things you notice, language, right? That kind of stuff. But all of that is pretty much not what's actually holding that culture together. It's just the really obvious manifestations. What's really going on is this huge thing under the surface, this enormous iceberg that is unseen under the surface of the water, where you've got the values, the beliefs, the norms, the underlying assumptions that holds that culture together. So you've got, as you can see on this slide, if you can, examples like notions of beauty, religious beliefs, gender roles, notions of self, attitudes toward age, notions of modesty, views on raising children, concepts of fairness, the importance of time, those sorts of things, right? All of that is the stuff that when you're just moving through a particular culture and you are operating in a particular group,
And if you are of that culture,
generally, these are the things that go unnoticed because we just think of it as normal, the way things are. That's just how we do things here, right? So for example, if I go to Nicaragua, I'm going to immediately notice the language difference and the dress and the weather and what people do in that weather. But then I'm going to notice if someone says, I'll meet you at 3, they don't actually mean 3 o'clock. they mean sometime in the afternoon. Because in Nicaragua,
Brother-in-law.
my brother-in-law, time is polychronic, not monochronic. So the sorts of things that we just take for granted are around things like how time works, leadership being hierarchical, needing to have things written down in order for them to be real, punitive justice, retributive justice. These sorts of things are things that can get embedded in our understandings of just the way things are. Did you want to add something or ask a question, Kimberly?
I did want to add something. One of the complications for a community like SUUSI is that we have people who are coming from the South, people who are coming from Florida, people are coming from upstate New York, people are coming from DC, Denver, Michigan, New England. So we also have these other culture clashes in some of those ways that we understand our norms, our etiquette. And then I see views on raising children, and I think about how we have truly multi-generational community and different generations have parented differently.
Right.
And so suddenly I'm sitting here realizing that SUUSI in part not only has its own culture, SUUSI is also a blending of all of these cultures. And so we have additional things under the surface, like there's a whole bunch of other icebergs that are bumping up underneath the surface.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I'm so glad you brought that up, because what happens is there's always going to be all these different cultural realities bumping up against each other, like you just said. And what happens is when we aren't intentional about the culture that we are co-creating through our covenant, what happens is the dominant culture surrounding us, which for most of us is dominant US culture, becomes the default, right? So what happens is when you've got culture clash, when you've got different pockets, because not only do you have different age generational cultures, you've got different regional cultures that are combining, you also have the nurture culture, you've got the nature culture, you've got the culture of the barbecue sea, you've got, the dances have a culture, the different people who do different things within SUUSI. Even just in terms of programming, there's a different way we do things here within those different programming tracks even, right? All of those things. And so what happens is what decides which culture wins when there's a culture clash is power, right? So the dominant culture ends up being the default if we aren't being intentional about what we are taking on from dominant culture or from the culture of SUUSI as a whole, perhaps, and what we are taking on intentionally because it aligns with our values, and what has just sort of seeped in that isn't actually in line with our values, but is just the operating system that we were given when we arrived on this spot in the world, right? So that default operating system, most folks tend to not be even aware of. That's the one that, says time is monochronic and justice is retributive and leadership is hierarchical and stuff like that, right? It's not our fault that we have inherited that operating system for those of us for whom that's true, right? But it is our responsibility to notice it and to rewire ourselves and our communities when we notice that we have inherited things that are in conflict with our covenant and with our values, right? We have to work really hard to figure out what is under the surface, what's going on, and what are the things under the surface are helpful and are in line with our values, and what are the things under the surface are unhelpful and in conflict. So when we see a conflict happen at SUUSI, oftentimes what's happening is a culture clash, a sort of situation where someone's bringing certain expectations and norms and someone else is bringing other ones. And what determines who wins is who has the most power in our larger systems, whether that's the SUUSI system or the dominant culture.
Just say really quick that
Yes.
that seems to show up in the way that even though WCU is the staff on their own campus, we still have power because of our sheer numbers. And so that's kind of fucked up that we have power in a place that is not ours.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, sheer numbers, but also like the numbers of UUs who actually represent, right, the proximity to power. So that just, even if it wasn't a sheer numbers, it's just the archetype and the expectations and the culture people are bringing with them.
The social location.
The social location, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. That's a huge piece of this.
Absolutely.
So mostly we're talking about sort of, one is understanding what a bystander is, but also understanding that, you know, there's active bystanders and there's inactive bystanders, right? And we're hoping to move folks from simply being bystanders who witness and watch to bystanders who actually take action and intervene. So that's sort of where we're hoping. And just understanding that it's sort of, you know, it's just the witnessing of it, right? And it's a bystander is also somebody who, in and of their own sort of lens, is already evaluating like what is actually a transgression and what's our values. So it's really, the white bystander is really important because they are the arbiter of when to intervene, right?
So what gets in the way of being an active bystander rather than just a passive bystander?
Yeah. And so understand that there's a lot of, not all of these are at play all the time, but a lot of them are, right? So in some ways that things happen really fast. Like, you know, you're getting coffee, you're just on the move, and then there's something happening over here that, you know, you have to actually notice that it's a transgression, evaluate what to do, right? That's oftentimes it happens in an instant. And if we haven't done the work and ahead of time, it takes us a while to catch up. And so that's just true. Right. A big one is folks don't want to do it wrong. Right. There's this whole process of sort of, you know, this level of perfectionism. Right. And part of this, for hopefully for you, is an invitation to, we're going to give you some skills, but we're also going to give you permission to do the thing. Right. Like just do the thing. And then, you know, the more you do the thing, actually, the better at it you get, but also the more grace you have for yourself and for others as you do the thing. Right. Situational ambiguity is sort of a really technical term, but it's this notion of not quite knowing. Like, it's like that. It's not that, you know, there's things that are very clearly transgressions, right? Someone's in someone's face, someone's really sexually inappropriate, hands are on someone, like instantly you're like, whoa, no, right? And then there's some stuff where you're just sort of like, is that happening? Is it not happening? And kind of trying to read the room as well. And so just, those are the things that we want to actually really attend to and ahead of time think through a little bit about, like, what often happens at SUUSI, because that will actually lower the threshold for ambiguity. If you think about that, these are common things that happen. And so these are things I want to actually have on my radar that we might not have noticed before because we didn't know that they had a larger impact, right? Pluralistic ignorance. What a term. We tried to find another term. This is actually a sociological term, but it's this interesting concept, and it's really important here, which is that a single person may have actually an experience of seeing something as wrong, but often those around us don't register. They're not reflecting back their own inner world. And so we tend to think that we're the only ones that hold this because we're not seeing what's up. We're not seeing their responses. Right. And so we think, oh, actually, this must be okay with them. Right. That happens often, where sort of either a minority view gets perceived as a majority view because of the inability to read the room and no one's talking openly. Right. And it's also the other way, that lots of folks can believe a particular thing, but because no one's talking about it, they begin to think it's just them. And this is really important here, because when you notice something and you're like, that's so not okay, but everyone else is sort of like not registering it for a whole lot of other reasons. Not that they don't see it, but they're just not showing you in their faces and their body language. You can actually lower the ambiguity by simply reacting, by simply going, oh, that doesn't seem cool. That actually begins to make the situation less ambiguous and invites other people to go, oh yeah, I noticed that, but I know what to do, right? So those are the interesting things that actually begin to lower the obstacles that get in our way to actually assessing and intervening. Perceived cost is a big one. And I will tell you that these are the things that we think about ahead of time, right? Which is perceived cost of status. Some folks actually perceive cost of jobs, right? Income, like belonging, you know, these are real things. And often that can get in the way. You know, I can tell you that there's a cost to be paid, particularly for those of us who have less power in general and are trying to intervene with folks with more power. That cost is real, right? And And so being part of it is understanding that, and also understanding that as somebody, like if I know that there's a cost for me to pay by intervening and I come to you because you're not going to bear this cost, you need to quickly understand that's why I asked, right? And to not question the cost. I've come to you and said, I can't bear the cost of that. I need you to go. You just go, right? Like really understanding that we all don't pay the same cost, right? Mm-hmm. Diffusion of responsibility, most folks are familiar with this, which is that the more people are around, the less likely or the less pressure we individually feel to respond, right? And this has been true for a long time. We've known this. And so simply understanding that there's a sort of a tendency that's pulled from us to look around, and if no one acts, we don't. So we have to go into situations knowing that that's real, and that if we get into motion, other folks get into motion. It actually, again, it consolidates responsibility to everyone, right? It kind of wakes people up is probably the best way to describe that. Social and cultural norms they're huge, right? Like this whole thing about being nice, right? Not making a scene, right? Not being rude. Again, there's a whole bunch of gendered rules around these things that we really need to kind of be aware of that. And I often talk about the difference between nice and kind, right? That nice centers social convention and kind centers care. And sometimes kind is actually kind of gruff, right? And so really thinking through, I'm willing to be a heretic to the dominant culture in order to provide care. And that's a big part of sort of a choice that we make moment by moment by moment. And the other is status and power, right? And again, that's real. And so if I am somebody who, I'm soon to be 55 years old, got gray hair, right? I look a particular way, I sound a particular way, that if I'm intervening and I know that the person in front of me is younger, right? Isn't white, right? Non-binary, all of these things, I have to really be careful about the way I approach, because I don't want to actually be paternalistic, condescending, right? I want to be like, hey, right? But I need to understand where I am in that power. Whether I feel like a nice person or not doesn't matter, right? I carry a representation with me. And it's also true the other way, like actually expecting young adults or youth to intervene with elders when they're right? They need to intervene. That stuff, sometimes we have to watch to actually lend our power to the person intervening because of where that social location is. And those are really important to know. Mm-hmm.
So what supports intervention? We talked about what gets in the way, what supports it. One of the top things that supports, good intervention, being an active bystander, is having a toolbox of skills and options, and knowing that there are multiple things that you can do in any particular moment. And that if you start to do one thing, like perhaps look around the room and be like, telling other people nearby that you're not cool with what's happening, that then you can then do the next thing, and then you can do the next thing. There's a whole ladder tree of things that can be done. So running through those sorts of things in your mind at a particular time is really important and useful, so you don't get stuck. Faith grounding, super helpful, super supportive to remember that when we're doing these things, this is living our faith. It is living our faith. It is living our covenant to help each other practice our values and live our covenant together, right? So calling on your sense of faith, calling on what connects you to that which is larger than ourselves, and what connects you to other human beings and other life, right? Those are the sorts of things that we can call on when we are in that kind of situation. Understanding SUUSI's covenant and what it calls us to do. It is a relatively new covenant. I think not everybody has really taken the time to sit with it and really take in what is in SUUSI's covenant, what we have promised when we show up in a SUUSI space. So really getting familiar with it, right? Committing it to memory and to your heart, basically. Using privilege strategically. This is a really key one. As Teo was talking about a little while ago, being aware of the privilege that you are bringing relative to a particular situation is the first step of really understanding how your social location plays in, whether that's your race, your class, your social standing in the community, your disability or abilities, your gender, your sexuality, your age, your level of education, whether you have gray hair, the sorts of things that then lend sort of power and privilege to you in a space relative to other people, and how to use that privilege strategically. Whether you have social capital that you can spend in a particular setting when other people don't, because there isn't going to be as much of a cost to you. So thinking that through is helpful.
It's also about in the strategic is partly like I can actually sometimes just show up and like create an interruption, but what I don't want to do is then do the next thing, which is take up space, right? Like if someone's actually able to name what's happening for them and why this isn't okay, then it's not mine to name. But if I'm there and I interrupt the sort of charge and the dynamic, sometimes simply my being there interrupts the dynamic, but that's enough, right? I don't want to do the next thing, which is, just take up all the space in the room and lecture, right? Like it's being really aware of what's mine to do, what's my right size in this moment, and then who am I interacting with and all of the players involved. So I am mindful of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of situations where literally just putting your body nearby can be the first thing and possibly the only thing that's necessary in a particular situation, because then that then gives the other people in that situation more options. They can look to you if they need help. They can, there's a witness to what's happening, those sorts of things, right? Yeah, thank you for sharing that. The last thing is just understanding that intervention doesn't have to be immediate, and it can be multifaceted and involve others. Like we started with, none of us are in this alone. We are a community. So being able to think through, I witnessed something earlier today. I've been sitting with it. I'm not okay with it. I want to talk to other people about it, whether that's the SUUSI helpline, woo, SUUSI helpline, whether that's, the folks that you are attending SUUSI with, if you've got some folks that you want to chat with about what you witnessed, those sorts of things, you can always follow up in certain ways. That's always an option. There's no statute of limitations on bystander intervention, right? And it can be multiple types of things that can happen in any particular time. So those are things to keep in mind.
It's important to understand that sometimes more makes things worse, right? So is this a moment to just interrupt, right? And to just diffuse and then address the situation with this person later? Does it need more in the moment? If I intervene with somebody who's like berating a staff member, but that staff member's boss is there, if I come in, I'm likely to actually cause more problems for the person working than not, right? Because hospitality, right? And so really being mindful of like how much is necessary now, and then how much can someone take in later? And again, that's what multifaceted is, right? Like interrupt and then educate later sometimes, right? Because the person needs to settle. They need to be able to like get over whatever happens so they can hear you, right? They can take in what's going on. And those are often really ways to think through like the whole decision tree of what happens. All right. This is just like a little fancy way of remembering these things, but there's some kind of components to this that are ways of thinking about the facets of intervention, right? And the sort of options and the ways that intervention can happen. So sometimes distract, like it's literally changing someone's gaze, right? Hey, Bob, we were going to get some coffee, right? Like just simply, it's a situation that's almost just about ready to kick off, or we're not too far down that hole and we're just going to go get coffee, or, whatever that is. That's actually an incredibly useful tool because it just takes the attention off the person who just shouldn't be the center of attention in the moment. But nothing else needs to happen, or maybe it needs to happen later, but just kind of those moments. Direct is really important because particularly in cultures that have a lot of conflict aversion, that practicing how to say things that are kind but truthful, right? Like, hey, name things as they are. Don't speak around them. No euphemisms. But to really be able to do that in a way that is need not be harsh or abrupt, but this really only works or works the best when there's a social connection between the two people, right? If this is a stranger, like the directness is probably not the first thing I would do because I don't know who they are. I don't know what their capacity is. And so being aware of that. Delegate happens in a number of different ways, right? Like, whoa, what's happening is too close to actually my own woundedness and my own identities that I can see it. I know it's not okay, but I need to go get somebody. Or, you know what, this situation is kind of probably going to take a couple of us to go. All right. Or, you know what, this has really gotten out of hand and I'm going to interrupt it. Or maybe I can't interrupt it, or it's already gone by. And then knowing that I need to actually go delegate to SUUSI staff and volunteers, right? And all of those things. Again, it's not just on one person to carry the load. And that's very important to remember. Delay, again, we've said, like, all the things don't have to happen in the moment. So it's a matter of sometimes being like, okay, I stopped the thing, let's all cool off, let's come back. Or, you know, so I think part of white supremacy culture is this sense of urgency and like the nowness, like everything has to be now. And the more that we create spaciousness, the more likely we are to have a positive impact on everyone involved. And so it's about stepping back, breathing, and knowing that when the immediate emergency or urgency kind of has ended, then we make the next choice, right? And that pause is huge. Mm-hmm. Document is actually a big thing. And we've seen that at all different scales, right? Hey, you know, this happened. It was pretty egregious. This wasn't a minor kind of thing. This was pretty egregious. And it seemed like it got resolved in the moment, but I want to let the SUUSI folks know that this happened. I think this is actually particularly important when you have someone who is simply just resistant to change, right? We want to know who those folks are because we want to allocate resources in that direction, right? Some folks actually require a little bit more intention. They might require being sat down, right? They might require a vacation from SUUSI. Like there's a number of things, but if we can't do that indiscriminately. So helping SUUSI know who to actually pay attention to, or knowing that, hey, you might want to go check with staff because this didn't seem cool. You might want to go like address that now. Those are the kinds of things that what documenting means, is creating sort of a record or way of actually passing this information on so that the folks who are actually tracking the entire bigger picture have a beat on what's happening overall.
Yeah. It really helps the community when we can do that as a whole. The only thing I wanted to add is that with delegate, we talked a little earlier about this, but just to be really clear, sometimes delegate means I need to find the person who can be direct, right? So direct is we're having this direct conversation, super clear.
You can find your friend.
This was something that I don't think was in line with our values. This broke covenant in this particular way, or just, hey, I know we're really stressed. I know we just had this thing and I just want to call you back into community with me. You know, I don't think this was you. And so like Teo said, that kind of directness works best when there's an existing relationship or some kind of commonality between the two people. So sometimes there's going to be a situation where, let's say someone sees my pronouns and is like, what? I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to be able to have a direct conversation with someone in a way that will actually call them back in that moment. I need to find their friend to talk to them, right? So those are the sorts of things we can think about when we think about the relationship between some of these things. The other thing is some of these things, in fact, all of these things can be multiple. We can use multiple of these things in any particular situation. We could first distract and then be direct. We could first delegate and then that person can be direct. We could delay and document. You know, document can be true for any number of different things, right? So thinking about the ways that these can play together as well.
Absolutely.
Perfect.
And I want to go back to something that Emily said in the chat, which is that many people who say they provide brutal honesty are more interested in the brutality than the honesty.
Yes.
And so I'm wondering, how do we, let's say somebody is intervening, but it is not well presented.
Right. Yeah,
They're
like what
being
happens when
direct, but they're like,
Yes, the intervener
needs
needs to be intervened with.
exactly.
And the Quakers have a beautiful way of talking about this in that, is what I'm about to say going to move us towards wholeness, right? And again, thinking about that, which includes, right, the how I say it, the way, like all of those things. If you are the person who's on the receiving end of this and are, you're a trans person of color, use whatever words and whatever tone you've got, right? Like it's also about who gets to have that expression. But by and large, if this is somebody who has the power, the resources, and the space to use some other language, then right, then
They have a
they're
responsibility.
responsible, and we have a responsibility to be like, you know what, you are totally on the right track, but I think it would be easier to hear this if, right? Like, so yeah, I brutal honesty is just one of those things that I think it's an excuse to practice superiority rather than care and community, right?
Yes. So the document thing, I think that can be really important. I'm someone who has ADD, and I can just sometimes remember something didn't feel good, but like not have the details, and those details can matter to others' perception of the situation and whether they'll do something about it, whether they'll whether leaders will respond to that or not, and or how they'll respond. So I think that making a note on your phone is something that's very useful, but I also want to note that SUUSI is a place where people really feel like they can be themselves in a way that they also can't in the real world, and to be very I would be very hesitant to video someone without their consent unless it was a very extreme situation. So I just wanted to note that.
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's sort of like way at the end of,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a range within each of those Ds, right?
Mhm.
There's like the range of the stakes where like death and extreme bodily violence might happen to this is a minor sort of situation where people aren't being their best selves, right? So how we react within that realm,
right?
For each of those Ds, there's going to be a different level of what we do depending on the situation. So thank you for pointing that out. Yeah. So we got a little bit into the practices for successful intervention, but did you want to talk about this one more?
Yes. So centering the humanity of everyone involved, and it doesn't take long, right? But it's a moment of, if I'm about ready to intervene and I just take a breath and I'm like, okay, like, right. And I really need to register that these are human beings in front of me, right? I want to intervene in a way that holds that, right? I don't want to do things that add to yet another level of dehumanization that, is rampant at the moment, right? So for me, that is like, right, like I can absolutely vehemently disagree with somebody, but my spiritual practice requires me to never do anything that detracts from their humanity, right? So for me, it's very huge. And that doesn't mean that like people are off the hook. It actually, for me, gives me permission to go in, right? Because I'm like, I know this is somebody this is a human being that I care for, or that I care for humanity in general, right? And this is important to all of us, including them, right? But it's never to see people as less than, and which leads to sort of avoiding antagonism and self-righteousness, which I think is part of what the brutal honesty thing is always, and often this is something that I encourage beforehand to create as a practice, so that in the moment you have a quicker catch. But is my desire to intervene because the situation actually needs me, or is it about having an audience, right? And about my street cred or whatever that is. And sadly, that's true, right? Or how I intervene. Am I doing it in a way that actually is beneficial and necessary for the situation at hand? Or am I intervening because I want to be seen as a nice person, a good person, that person who read all the anti-racist books, and now I'm going to act them out. Like, and again, like this happens, right? And I have seen this often. The antagonism piece is sometimes just body language. I have watched big white cis men simply by just getting bigger, no matter what words are coming out of their mouth, they physically just get bigger, they get closer, and the energy goes up, right? So it's also just sort of body awareness, just body language, right? All of those things can feed into this. And so self-awareness is really huge. And this is also why the intervening with the intervener, like if you're there and someone goes to intervene, just sort of like keep an eye on what that happens, because you can read the situation when people are in it, often have tunnel vision. So the goal is de-escalation, right? And the truth is that one, harm reduction, harm reduction, harm reduction, right? Like stop the harm from happening, but also the folks that we want to call back into covenant, the folks that we actually want to help reduce the behaviors that are taking them out of social connection and that likely get in their way, right? That they can't hear us, they can't take anything in if their blood pressure is still pumping, they've been sort of tight, they're tunnel vision, right? And they're really tight, like nothing we say is going to matter until they breathe, until their shoulders come down, until their sight widens, right? And so we just need to be aware of that the stages at which we're at.
Yeah.
Recruit help if needed. And we've talked about that a number of times, but that goes, in multiple directions, but it's really being aware of that we are all in this together, and there is no shame. There's no shame of actually getting into something and then being like, whoa, I'm over my head and coming out, right? It's not always just in the beginning, but it's like, not going as I thought. Let me look around to see who can help me out, right? So you can actually exit and come back, or like start making eye contact, wave your hands, whatever you need to do. But there's no shame in that. There's no shame in waiting in and having it not go as you were hoping. And again, be honest and direct whenever possible. But again, in the moment, sometimes that's not actually what's going to help us in the moment de-escalate, right? And so really being aware of those things.
Mm-hmm.
So
just to add a couple of things to a couple of these, one of the things I think around de-escalation that we were talking about earlier was the fact that sometimes de-escalation requires bringing the energy down, and sometimes de-escalation requires bringing the energy up a little bit, right? So being aware of, in any particular situation, how to manifest a de-escalation of the situation, and that might call for different tactics in different situations, right? One of the things that's cool about recruiting help is that as we engage with this practice as a community, then it becomes a community effort, and we can say, hey, I think there might be something going on across the room. Will you come with me and let's just go check it out, right? That's the kind of recruiting help that we can do. It doesn't have to be a big deal. You're just trying to be aware. We're trying to practice a new type of awareness in every space that we're in at SUUSI. Who's on the edges? What's going on? Body language, tone of voice. We're trying to use our spider senses in new ways, instead of just being, I'm having a great time at SUUSI, I'm just here eating my breakfast by myself, right? I'm getting my needs met. So being able to practice that as a community is really huge.
There's a question?
Yes, question, comment from Kimmy.
Yeah, just I can imagine, I'm a pretty calm person, and so I can imagine how I would bring it, de-escalate through bringing the energy down. Can you give me an example of what it would be like to bring the energy up?
Yeah, absolutely. And then again, this is a far more, it's a wider conversation around trauma, but when folks are actually on the receiving end of violence, energy that feels harsh, right? If that person has a default trauma response of shutting down, right? That, and I'm one of those people, that sometimes actually lightness and levity, right? Like, and I'm not talking about like dismissal, but I'm like, that lightness and levity has an energy to it that can actually take someone who's frozen and bring them up a little bit. And again, it's not frenetic, because that'll shut somebody down into overwhelm, but it is about when folks are frozen. And it's the same true for folks who might actually be an aggressor, right? But it's coming from a trauma place and they're locked down, right? That they actually can't, right? Like it's a lockdown. And so sometimes that lightness actually will unlock a trauma response, and it settles folks' nervous system. And it's really paradoxical, but it can work. And again, it's a larger conversation around trauma, but it is actually an effective thing.
Yeah.
It's a skill that takes some skill, like I will tell you, but it's something to kind of be aware of.
And I'm also glad you brought that up, because we talked about this a little bit, but I think it's just really important to restate that when conflict happens, when these sorts of situations where people aren't being their best selves take place, there's usually a reason of some kind, right? And so we also have to attend to what the possible thing might be going on for everybody involved in that situation, right? It might be, I haven't left my house in 2 years because of COVID. And this is the first time that I get to gather in community. And then the first thing that happens is I run up against the fact that I don't have any resilience right now. I'm at my max. So being aware of the fact that all of us are sort of, for the most part, not able to access our best selves very well right now, all the time, because of the ways our resources are depleted. And a lot of people need to be able to attend SUUSI in order to re-resource themselves. And so that also means the stakes are going to be a lot higher this year because of the fact that you've got a lot of folks with a lot of hopes and needs and expectations and, oh, it's been 2 years. And then we're going to bump up against each other. So being able to not jump immediately to this person is doing a terrible thing, judgment, self-righteousness, but first ask what might be going on, what's going on, and how can I connect to somebody on that level of being like, I think maybe we just need to take a step back. Will you come with me to go get coffee, that kind of thing? Yes. Jan, go ahead.
Thank you. I had an experience as an intercultural development instrument administrator and the training and who are our neighbors. We also went through the whole culture and conflict.
Nice.
And I am one of those people who's like, okay, could we all just calm down and have a reasonable conversation? But I've been in a couple of situations. I could see that what was really needed was for me to match the energy.
Yes.
Say, I hear how upset you are. I get it. I really want us to come to some conclusion on this and work this out together. So I'm with you. Like, match that energy.
Yep.
And it is not my default, so it takes practice.
Mine either. Right.
That's another great example of sometimes needing to bring the energy up instead of the energy down. Thank you so much for that.
And knowing our defaults and knowing sort of where we need to attend, right? It's like obviously, his energy is up most of the time, right? So for him to lower his energy, he has to breathe first, right? To be able to go in, because that's not his default, right? As opposed to me, that I have to gear up to raise it up. So yeah.
Exactly.
And to be clear that what you're raising is you're bringing that energy, but you're not combative. You're not arguing with them. You're affirming them. You're, yes.
There's a trauma. Deb Dana has a talk about state matching, right? And that in order to actually exist in someone's world who's in a trauma response, you actually have to state match. You have to actually get into their frame of reference. And sometimes, right? So it's always a notch below where they're at, and it's without all of the charge. But people can't. You don't exist in their world if you don't actually state match in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, we should move on. But the last thing is, I realize we haven't talked about the fact that there may be intervention needed on multiple sides of a particular situation. First of all, there may not be two sides. There may be like 5 people who are all having an issue, right? Big feels, right? And so when we think about intervention from a place of helping people access their best selves, that can help sometimes, but we also still need to be very clear about the power dynamics involved and whether there may be harm happening. Just because somebody is yelling doesn't mean that person isn't the person being harmed, right? Mm-hmm. So those are the sorts of things we do need to be aware of, but there may be a reason to just, we need to call for pastoral care. We need to call for, different resources given the situation. So just things to keep in mind as we move forward. So what we're going to do next is, because we're in this large Zoom space, we don't have a lot of time. We didn't want to go into like a formal role-playing kind of situation, but we also did still want to give people a chance to sort of actually practice this and start thinking about and literally getting into your bodies around what would you do in a particular scenario. We're going to have a number of scenarios. And we will share this quick scenario with you, and then we're going to go around and have approximately 7 or 8 people share what would you say in this moment. Not what would you do, but what would you say.
You're going to actually intervene.
You're going to intervene with the person in the scenario. What would you say? And what's going to happen is it's a rapid response. It's a lightning round. So you're just going to first and best,
Or pass.
or pass. You can say pass. I don't want to do this one, and we'll go to the next person,
Right.
and we'll just go through the people who want to play.
So to kind of clarify, it's sort of like, like you see this happening, blah, 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 and it wouldn't be, I would walk up to them. It would be, hey, Bob. And again, there's no shame in this. It's sort of, it's part of it is, if there is hesitancy or something comes up, this is simply for you to notice that, because this is a time to notice that, right? It's like, oh, I responded differently than I thought I would, or I should maybe think that through, or get some more like folks to talk about it.
Mhm.
It's also just in the doing it when the stakes are low, so you have a sense of kind of what comes up for you. So,
Yeah, exactly.
all right. You see a SUUSI attendee approach a WCU staff member smoking on their break in a smoking area, and that person starts telling them how bad smoking is. What do you say?
Kimberly.
Hey, hey, let's go check out what the kids are doing in the fountain. Or, hey, I love this smoking area. Let's go, let's step away from it for a minute. And then probably just do a, hey, they're allowed to smoke on their break, and, everybody's making their own choices for their bodies and their health, and it's okay.
Great. Jan.
Yeah, secondhand smoke can be really, really a thing. So let's you and I go step over here and have a chat.
Lucy.
Hey, let's let this person enjoy their break, and you and I go check out something over here.
Kimmy.
Yeah, I hate secondhand smoke. I'm really glad you care about people's health, but let's go over here.
Angel.
I used to be a smoker, and this doesn't make me really comfortable, so let's just hang out somewhere else.
Nice. Rachel.
Hi, my name's Rachel. How many SUUSIs have you been going to?
And Emily.
Hey, this is awesome, but let's come over here real quick. I just wanted to touch base with you for a second, and then, hey, so that doesn't necessarily feel like an appropriate thing to say to a stranger, even though I totally hear you on the health implications. Maybe that's something that would make somebody feel uncomfortable, and I know you would never be the type of person who would want to make somebody uncomfortable, so I figured I would just like let you know, because you might not have realized kind of the impact that conversation was having.
Awesome. Thank you all so much.
Let's go through the next one, and then we'll stop and maybe talk about some nuance and some options.
Yeah.
All right.
Great.
The person in front of you at registration makes a disgruntled fuss about the pronoun stickers or buttons and says they will never call someone they. What do you say?
Kimmy.
Wow, change is difficult. I totally get it. I had a really hard time with this gender stuff when it first started too. Can we have a talk?
Lucy.
Oh gosh. I think that I would look around for a cis SUUSI friend who I know is cool and understand these things, because I would probably not respond in a helpful way.
It's also okay to like say out loud what you would say to someone else in this scenario as well. Be like, I need you to go over there.
Go get your people.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Emily.
Hey, so there are a few options while you're learning somebody's pronouns, like referring to them by their name, or just, not necessarily talking about them. Usually you don't have to use somebody's pronouns unless you're talking about them to somebody else. So as long as you're talking to them, all you have to do is use their name.
Great. Kimberly.
Hey, so I know this is hard, and I struggle too, but let's talk about this, and maybe talk a little bit about how language changes, and if that's where their objection is, hey, let's have a talk about that.
Amy.
I would pick up something from the table and say, hey, somebody left their favorite pen. I hope they remember where they left. Oh, wait. We do this all the time. Hey, let's go talk about it.
Awesome. Great crowd reaction to that one. Jan?
I couldn't come up with it as clever as Amy did. That's
Yeah,
what I was thinking. Like, we use they all the time in our language. But also, yeah, like, yeah, this takes some getting used to. And let's go talk about how these pronouns, what's going on for you in this? What's coming up for you when with all this change? You wanna chat?
Perfect. Angel?
Let's talk about pronouns.
Nice. Dave?
I hear you. It can be difficult and a challenge, and I have a lot of difficulty with it myself, but I want to be called by my name and my pronouns, and I guess people should be entitled to be called by theirs.
I see what you did there. Thank you all so much for playing the game.
Yep.
Although I think we're all going to adopt the Amy Carroll Webb approach now.
Doing something is better than nothing, right? And again, once you're in motion, the next words will come, right? So sometimes you get started and you're like, oh, that wasn't where I wanted to go, right? Breathe, right? And go. But it is the creating momentum is the hardest part of that. So actually moving forward, like that is the biggest part of the thing. And you're going to stutter, you're going to stumble, and you're going to be like, but breathe and do something, right? And make that connection again. And it is important, right? Like there's a lot of times that I don't have the spoons. I can't take another hit. And so but I am going to tug on someone's shirt and be like, go there, so all of those things are true. And those are the ways to go. I will say that one of the things that I am especially mindful of in UU context is class. It is one of the biggest barriers for me every single time I enter a UU congregation. It's the thing that makes me want to walk out the door faster than anything else. And so I'm really mindful about anything that has an edge of shame around class. So the smoking one, right? We know how smoking shows up. We know who gets targeted. We know why people smoke. We know who has to bear the stress of that, right? All of those things are true. And so as I'm intervening, often I'm going to intervene, but acknowledging the person who's been harmed, like, hey, enjoy your break. We're going to go over here, right? Like it's that humanizing of it. So I never want to intervene in a way that leaves the person haranguing with you're doing something awful, but we're going to go over here, right? I don't want to do that. And it's particularly around, race, class, ability, all of those touch buttons, but class gets overlooked a lot, well, almost always in dominant cultural UU spaces. So being mindful of that, right? And I think class is one of the big ways, in combination with other things that SUUSI folks get in trouble, right? Is sort of this entitlement in its truest sense of the word, and that our values are better than other people's values, right? And again, we can all understand a whole bunch of things about what we think is healthy, what we think of as well-being, but the system is designed to make a lot of us unwell and not to have us access well. And so it's not our business, right, to remind anybody of that. It's our business to create a culture that provides care. And so one of the other things that came to mind was, and I think that the SUUSI covenant and this whole intention to change is actually your opportunity. So the pronoun one, right? Grumbling, and it's like, hey, you know what? Like, we actually are trying to create a more welcoming space. And so we're trying to intervene on stuff like this. And I don't think this is a place. Come on over here, right? Like it's actually naming, we're not doing this anymore, right? We've been given permission to, right? Or, you know what? Hey, this is one of the things that gets us in trouble. Let's go over here, right? You've been given permission to actually say that out loud. And so I think it's okay to really use that. Like, right, this is actually part of what we're intending to do. We're on a new path, and I think that's it. It often, those things help me when I don't know what to do next. It'll buy me the time, and it also gives me the reason to be intervening. Like, who the heck are you? And I'm like, well, you know what? I'm a representative of this covenant. Here you go.
Right? Exactly. Which is a reason why knowing that SUUSI covenant is so important. having that SUUSI covenant in your heart, in your bones, as you go into SUUSI, to be able to say, this isn't, that gives you an authority as a member of this community to say, hi, other member of this community, here's how we act together. This is who we are. This is the reminder that I know things are hard right now. I know you're struggling with whatever, and let's go talk about it, because I don't think you're accessing your best self at the moment. I don't think you're living out our values in this moment, right? So let's figure out how to fix that. One of the things very quickly is just the thing to think about with these two scenarios we threw at you. One of them involves a WCU staff, a person who actually is being accosted or harmed or potentially harmed in some way. The other one involves someone just saying to the world, gosh, I don't like pronouns. And so you don't know who's listening, right? So in one of these situations, there is somebody who needs to be attended to, like Teo said, of like, please keep enjoying your break. You're doing a great job. I know we're out of coffee in the cafeteria. It's not your fault. I know it's not your fault. Thank you so much for what you're doing to serve our community and help us out. Those sorts of things, right? To sort of acknowledge the person who has been interacted with in a crummy way. And then in the other scenarios where someone does something that that can impact people who are watching, that will impact people who are watching, that calls for a slightly different approach, those two scenarios.
But again, like I will tell you that when I have watched cis folks get into motion unprompted is huge, right? So like not even knowing, like, is there a trans person around here? No, like we're watching.
I'm only going to say something if there is a visibly person of color who might be offended by the racism that has been expressed. Right. Nope.
And guaranteed you, like, if I'm behind you in line, you're not going to register that pronoun stuff was tweaky for me, right? You're not going to actually, I'm not on your radar, but we're noticing. And so it really is, there is something so reparative of watching someone shield you and provide refuge without having to ask for it. Right? It's just this moment of, oh, right. So really, those are the things that sort of get me into motion, is like, I know what this feels like when someone moves without being asked. I really know what that feels like. And so here I go, whether I humiliate myself or not, right? Here I go, I'm going to go, because I understand what that feels like on the receiving end of that.
I know a couple of times in our chat and in our conversation, we've been raising the issue that there are some who absolutely treat SUUSI as a vacation, and both university staff and frankly SUUSI staff as servants, for lack of a better term. And there are many people who volunteer or work on staff because it's the only way they can be here. Obviously, staff, whether they're faculty members or janitorial staff, they're working. And so I wonder about some tools and maybe things we can say when it's that kind of behavior.
I love the idea of having stock phrases, right? Yeah. That you can just pull out of your pocket. I think that's a great idea. Also the framing. Yeah. Cynthia.
So in your scenarios, the WCU staff who is smoking, or the SUUSI goer who is saying something anti-trans, I think our roles are clearer. But what do we do if those situations are combined and it's a WCU staff person saying, like, as a trans member of SUUSI walks by, oh, I just don't agree with this whole pronoun thing? Then our bystander needs of not addressing the WCU staff and addressing this harm are in conflict. So how do we handle that?
Great question.
I mean, I think there's room to intervene, but again, always intervening with the understanding of the power dynamic, right? Like, again, like we don't know what people have been exposed to. We don't know the access that folks have to, education materials, and the truth is, again, around class, right? Grammar is one of those things that gets used to shame people. And so it may, it's always those things are on my kind of radar, but it is possible to say, you know what, like, hey, like this may be new for you, but I'm going to guess that hurt that person's feelings. Like, and and again, that might be enough, and again, if the person pushes back, then it becomes a whole other issue. But hey, and again, sometimes it might not change that person's behavior, but the person who had to hear that crap, it matters that you said something, right? But again, always mindful of the power dynamic, right? And because there's a power differential, sometimes speaking in a quieter voice carries a huger impact because they can't write you off, right? So it's all of those things of being mindful of that.
Yeah. And it really is important to attend to things like role, race, class, social location, gender, age, being able to attend to those sorts of things, because there's no template approach to any of this. It has to be embodied. It has to be responsive to the context, no matter what that context is. So we do need to be thinking about what to do in instances of conflicting needs. And it's not binary. We shouldn't be thinking of this as there's always going to be a victim and a perpetrator. That's not how we live this faith. That is not what we believe, right? So being mindful of all those power dynamics are really, really important. So thank you for bringing that up.
And I'm thinking this is one of those times too, as I think through it myself, when, if that simple response of, hey, that might have hurt that person's feelings doesn't, they push back from there. That's when you take it to SUUSI core staff and say, this incident happened with WCU staff, I witnessed it.
Right.
It's not mine to solve at that point. It's like hand it up.
And again, that right, that's something that can get to the college, supervisors, where it's like, hey, your folks need some information around this stuff. And if you want, here's some resources if you want to do that, right? Like that becomes their cultural stuff that they need to actually probably work on.
Yeah, and that could have a much bigger impact in the long run, doing something like that. And Kimmy said, and letting the person who was harmed know it was heard and painful. Right. And then perhaps taking that person and being like, how are you doing? Gosh, that looked really painful. Do you want to go chat? Do you need some pastoral care? Those are important things that we can do. Yeah. Okay, so we're almost there. We've a couple more things we wanted to chat with you about.
Yeah. So always in the scenarios that we're talking about, there are sort of three spheres or three kind of lenses that are at play at any given time. And we've talked a lot about the bystanders. We've talked a lot about what the view is from the bystander's perspective, and the things that we, as people who want to be and move into being active bystanders, the things, the practices we should do ahead of time, right? All of those things. We've talked about that, but we haven't really talked about the other two spheres and experiences that are happening at the same time. And kind of the prep work that can go ahead of time.
So we basically want to make sure that folks are thinking about not only, like you just said, not only how to be a bystander, how to prepare yourself, the practices for being an active bystander, but also how to prepare yourself for perhaps encountering microaggressions, harm, having situations happen at SUUSI that feel kind of crummy, because like we've said, we're all sort of operating without a lot of resilience right now, and we're bound to bump up against each other sometimes. So preparing for having some of those bumpy experiences, things that you can do and think about in advance are things like centering your own care in the moment. If you're feeling activated, if something happens and you feel your heart rate go up, you start to, just feel jumpy in your skin a little bit of like, oh my gosh, I'm having a thing. This is not good. Being able to figure out, how can I center my own care in this moment? What do I need in this moment? Do I need to extricate myself from the situation? Do I need to literally interrupt someone and say, you know what? I'm really having a hard time right now, and I just need to go over there, right? It is okay. Again, talking about social norms, it is okay to ditch social norms in order to take care of yourself. Give yourself permission to transgress norms around niceness and politeness when you are feeling triggered, harmed in a crummy situation that is impacting you in a crummy way, right? It is okay to take care of yourself. And it's also important to think about and be prepared to pull in support from other people, whether that's in the moment, whether that's literally putting up a distress flag and going, help, I need an ally in this moment around who knows what, or whether it's later, whether it is processing something with somebody later, whether it is asking someone, hey, I had a really weird interaction with Bob earlier today. And do you think you could go talk to Bob? Because I don't feel like I can go there again, but it just didn't sit right with me. And I need someone to talk to Bob. Those sorts of things, right? And remember the SUUSI helpline. If you need to be connected with someone from the Covenant Accountability Team who can help you out, if you need pastoral care, if you have other resources that you need to access in that moment that can be available to you, that's such a good option and such a great resource to keep in mind. So that's things to think about. We should remember that when we are entering to SUUSI, we should be prepared and expect that at many times during SUUSI, we are going to be the bystander. We are going to be the person who is having a hard, triggery, perhaps being harmed kind of moment. And we are going to be the person who is not living our best self and needs someone to help call us back into care and community in that moment.
This is the one that none of us actually wants to contemplate for the most part, right? It's for those of us who have, particularly for those of who have had a deep practice of learning and interrogating dominant culture and, you know, the whatever interaction and roles we play within it. For us to actually contemplate that I may actually be the person that someone has to call in is not something that most folks that in my experience want to actually think about ahead of time, right? But this is the place where that can change an interaction in an instant. If you are the person being called in, the ways in which you are open and respond can just, it transforms a hard situation into a repair, like in a second, in many ways, right? And so some of it is simply, right, like ahead of time, like what's your practice when you know, that's a level of abruptness or something happens that calls you up short, whatever that is, like, do you have a practice for that, right? And for me, it's like, I take a breath, you know, like I very rarely I try very hard not to have anything come out of my mouth that isn't preceded by breath, right? And that has bought me time to not go out of habit energy and to choose my response, right? And so really thinking through, like, for those of us like who experience being checked or having our behavior pointed out, if our first response is shame, like, again, perfectly understandable cultural response, and particularly given our histories, who knows, but what do I do when I feel shamed, right? And thinking about that ahead of time. And again, the receiving, being called in as an invitation, right, is always, when someone approaches you to call you in, what they say is, we don't want to lose you, right? Is that, look, that was kind of some egregious behavior, but you're still important. I want you to stay, right? It's very easy to have people be disposable, but when you're on the receiving end of that, it's not easy. This is why the work has to happen ahead of time, which is that someone actually saw me as valuable enough to the community to risk my scorn, right? That to spend some social capital in order to approach me, right? And that's huge, right? And so that's a reframe that we have to go into, and it's a practice that we have to have ahead of time. Humility, right? I don't care how much work any of us have done, right? We are human beings and we misstep. It's not a free-for-all. I'm not saying like, whoa, go, but you know, and again, coming out of the pandemic, I don't know about the rest of you, but I have not been around a lot of people, right? So peopling is hard, right? It's really hard. And my social senses are overwhelmed most of the time. And I'm just a little bit more irritable with my threshold for like annoyance is way lower than it ever has been. And I'm just mindful of that, right? And so really tapping into my own humility about, because I'm on edge, I'm more likely to sort of misstep and just need to know that there's some grace in that. Already having relationships with folks that we can be like, whoa, you know, I did something, someone called me out. I don't quite get it, or I feel really ashamed. That's so out of my values. Like, I didn't even like having somebody that isn't the person in front of me, that I can just talk that stuff through. Those are things ahead of time that matter, right? And the ability to discern what repair looks like in that moment, right? It may not be the time. Sometimes some grace to be like stopping and be like, you know, you're right. Like that isn't who I want to be in the world. And I'm sorry. and I'm going to go over here, right? Like figuring out what that is, but and this is the sort of intention behind it. If I chase someone down because I want to prove I'm a good person and I want their absolution, not repair, right? Like, you know, those are the things that really to be mindful of, and to really understand that the ways that we embody this is going to reveal our spiritual practice far quicker than the ways that we intervene, right? And so this is sort of where I think the rubber meets the road in terms of our commitment to covenant and our commitment to community and our commitment to interconnectedness. This is where, at least in my experience, my pride versus my values gets tested on a dime. And all the work I've done ahead of time is what hopefully 65% of the time saves my butt, right? Like, so, and that we can begin again at any given time, right? I can react to being called out and then breathe. Like there's no wrong time for me to catch myself. If this locomotive left the station, doesn't mean I can't stop it, right? At any given time, I can pull myself back and say, okay, that didn't go well. You know, can I take a minute and let's talk about that? I'm sorry, right? Any of those things are actually at our disposal, but you have to practice them. You know, I've covered some of these already, but one of the biggest ones is honoring the difference between guilt and shame, right? Because when we transgress and someone has witnessed it and mirrors it back to us, it is actually a reasonable thing to feel guilty. That guilt actually will motivate change. But, you know, the guilt was, you know, I did that bad thing, right? That was not something that reflected my values versus, you know, I'm a horrible person, right? Like that sort of ears turning red, body curling in. That's a very different thing. And really changing our relationship to guilt and shame is a big part of doing this work in any time. Because if I can deal with my shame response and just recognize that, not my highest self, right? That will motivate change. You know, and hope for the best, prepare for the worst. Like, you know, generally speaking, we actually want to do the work ahead of time to know who we are, to know what power, privilege, and social location, all of those things are, and we're human beings. We are going to sandpaper against one another, just is what it is.
Can I speak to that?
Yeah.
I was having a wonderful conversation yesterday with Dave. And one of the things I said to Dave is like, what's the top thing that people can do to practice covenant? And Dave said, sleep. Right? I think that was so real, because even on a good year, people don't sleep enough at SUUSI. They want to do all the things, they want to have all the experiences, and that then layers on top of we're already crispy crunchy, and then we haven't gotten enough sleep, and we're just so quick to just not be our best selves. And so those are the sorts of things that we can do in advance. We can actually make a plan. I am going to sleep enough because I know that that will actually help me live my values. If I have more resources, if I have more gas in my gas tank to be able to respond when I get into a situation where I didn't do what I wanted to do. I didn't live the way I wanted to live, right? So just to point that out. And then, you know, like we said just a minute ago, we can always begin again. Begin again in love is something that one of my mentors, Dr. Janice Marie Johnson, has taught me. You can always begin again in love. Even if the locomotive has already left the station, you can be like, I'm going to try that again, right? And that is so important. And the last thing that is so important is to remember that this is a spiritual practice. This is part of living our faith. It's part of what, in a spiritual community, it's part of what it means to actually build and maintain. This is actually the glue that holds our community together when we are building the community that we strive to be. So it is that important. This work is so important in order for us to actually be spiritual people moving through the world in community, in a spiritual community. So, yeah. Whew. Your homework is, first of all, reflect. What strengths do you bring to this spiritual practice of intervention? What skills can you commit to using? Perhaps some of the skills we talked about today during this time. What skills that we talk about today that are a stretch? They feel like they might be a stretch for you, but you want to learn more and or try them on? And what is your social location and proximity to power? Super important to reflect on these things before you arrive at SUUSI, right? So please give those things some thought. And if social location, we've been using this word a lot. If that is a term that is new to you, it basically just means what are your different experiences and identities that make you who you are relative to privilege and power and marginalization. So all of who we are interacts with all the other ways in which we are who we are, right? So being able to figure out what kind of status and role and privilege and power you might be bringing in to the SUUSI community versus how much, experiences of exclusion or marginalization you might be bringing in and how those things interact with each other. The other piece of homework is recruit buddies. Find a buddy to do this work with. This is probably the most important thing that you can do to be able to practice this together. Find an accountability buddy. Maybe it's someone in your household. Maybe your whole household wants to be accountability buddies together. If you're attending SUUSI with a family or as a household, maybe it's a friend. Maybe it's a fellow volunteer if you are a volunteer at SUUSI, or a fellow staff person if you are a staff person at SUUSI. But find someone that you can check in with every day, perhaps multiple times a day, to say, how's it going? Have you noticed anything that you wanted to sort of intervene in, but you didn't really feel like you could? Did you get intervened with? Did someone call you back? And how did that go? Someone you can process with. And finally, talk up bystander intervention with other people. Talk about this as a family if you're attending as a family. Talk about it as a friend group if you're attending as a friend group. Talk about it when you get to SUUSI. You're standing in registration line and you're saying, hey, did you watch that video? I really, that was really interesting. What do you think? How are you going to practice it at SUUSI? Like, actively be talking about this when you are there.
So for the first time, we're creating connection circles. And we have some people who are already signed up, and Cindy Landrum is helping create the programming for those groups. But I think that they would be wonderful places to interact and reflect on some of these questions while people are connecting, often doing some fun things too. So I just want to remind you, if you're not signed up for a connection circle, do so. Encourage other people too. I think it's going to be a wonderful addition to our programming.
So good. So good. Thank you so much for that reminder. All right, stop in the share. Built-in buddies. So good. Very good for introverts.
Yep.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for going on this journey with us. It's been fun. I hope it was fun for you too. This doesn't have to be scary. It actually can be a fun thing to do together, and prepare ourselves for this beautiful spiritual work. So thank you for your commitment to SUUSI and your willingness to practice this and help other people practice this as a community.